The hall has certainly had its ups and downs, and the fact that it was almost demolished, when you think back at that, there's certain aspects of that that you just feel lucky about. The fact that the orchestra didn't leave the city, that we stayed here, and that we came back to the hall ultimately.
We had to bring a fresh, complete, overcoming spirit to this place, to rebuild it, in a sense, to recapture what happened in that summer of 1919.
When you would come to Detroit, it was there. It was the immovable object. I really can't imagine the Detroit Symphony playing somewhere else. I think this building is an essential part of the Detroit Renaissance.
The revitalization of Orchestral Hall was a monumental accomplishment, but the orchestra itself was still in the red. Hit by a struggling Detroit economy and cuts in funding for the arts, it would take a special personality to grow both the orchestra and its venue back to the kind of international prominence it knew during the early 20th century.
I think back to the days of Perret and Erling, Ciccato, Antal Dorati was a significant part of building the quality of the orchestra. Gunther Herbig brought a gravitas to the sound that I think was very special. And then Nemi comes in and takes all of that and adds sparkle, adds a polish, a sheen to it that I think was possibly missing from the immediate period earlier.
The music directors that we've had historically all speak to the unique history of the orchestra. They have been passionate, sometimes very colorful leaders, and Nemi was no exception.
The 1990s were very good years for the Detroit Symphony. They're back in their historic home. They have a very charismatic new music director named Nemi Järvi, who's Estonian-born, who makes a kind of instant connection with the audience.
To me, Nemi was a jewel. He was something that the orchestra needed. He provided a lot of energy. He provided a lot of musical charisma.
You knew that he was the person in charge. But at the same time, it was a very jovial quality. It was something that had a warmth to it. There was a little bit of sparkle in his eye, no matter what he was doing.
And I think he really enjoyed this hall because of the proximity of the audience to the orchestra. In many modern halls, the audience is more removed from the stage. And Nemi always enjoyed looking up at the boxes and you know, kind of giving a little a wink sometimes.
I loved watching him conduct. He had this sort of humor, this impishness to him that if you got to know him, he could be a lot of fun.
With Järvi at the helm, the Detroit Symphony Orchestra and Orchestral Hall were rejuvenated, making over 40 recordings and undertaking numerous international tours. Their success during the closing decade of the 20th century once again cemented Orchestral Hall's position as a world-class symphonic home. More importantly, though, Nemi Järvi, like Osip Gabrilovich, championed the idea of an orchestra's importance to the greater community. If the orchestra were to stay in Orchestral Hall for good, it would take more than just a revival of the old hall. It would take a transformation.
When I first came to a concert, which was in 1991, the neighborhood was not at all inviting.
By that time, we had lost half of our population from the peak in the 1950s. The auto factories had left, population and jobs and businesses were fleeing the city. And so there's a lot of sense of, well, why bother? Who cares about Detroit?
We just knew that we needed to revitalize this immediate neighborhood. And it was sort of out of that kind of thinking that the Orchestra Place project emerged.
When he talked to my father about this dream, my father told him, you're not thinking big enough. You've got to think bigger. The city needs DSO, and the hall in a way that you can't even anticipate at this point.
Education and outreach and everything else. We had talked about those things for years. That is the central spirit that got this hall built, that got this hall saved, that got this hall restored to a point where people said, okay, let's take that ball and let's make a game here.
The hall was built 100 years ago, so it didn't have dressing rooms. We had people in trailers, and it didn't have a place for the patrons to assemble before the program. So it needed some updating, and Peter Cummings led that, and Stanley Frankel, and they did a marvelous job with it. I mean, they were able to add those facilities without interfering with the acoustics of the hall.
It can't just be monolithic. The building needed to expand and it needed to adapt to its surroundings, but what it is and what it represents is the same as it's always been.
C. Howard Crane gave us this magnificent hall for classical music, but that's what this building is. And all that other stuff that is now considered part of the complex of a major symphony hall was left out because that just wasn't on the radar in those days.
So to have this beautiful building attached, I think helped everybody, staff, musicians, audience members. I think it was critical, again, to make this significant statement that we're here, we're going to stay here, we're going to help be a part of this community.
You know, what the orchestra did here is they started buying up land all around Orchestra Hall to make expansion possible. And then they bought the Winkleman's warehouse a block south of here and built an office building, which they then leased to the Detroit Medical Center, and there was ground floor retail. Then they donate land to the Detroit Public Schools. So now we've got this incredible performing arts high school going up. So in Detroit, what is more central than reinventing an entire city block, which is basically what the orchestra did.
When the Orchestra Hall finally reopened, that was one of the markers that said, we think we're back. We think Detroit has turned around. It was early. We had a long way to go. We still have a long way to go, I think. But it was one of those ones that say, hey, we can do this. And I think it was a point of civic pride that's hard to equal.
The only one event that will always be embedded in my mind is the first night we opened, after we redid the hall. I stood in the back, and I had this great fear that when I did the hall, I would have screwed up the acoustics. So at the break, two people were next to me who really knew. I said, how are the acoustics? I said, they're fabulous. I said, oh, thank goodness. I'll never forget that moment.
The MAX, as it was known, had cemented a new cornerstone for music and culture in the city and lit the spark of further revitalization down Woodward. The hall would face one more challenge, though, as health problems forced Naomi Yerry to announce that after the ribbon was cut on the DSO's expanded home, he would be moving on. This time, it would be the orchestra's musical directorship and not the hall itself that would sit empty, just when it needed it most.
When I arrived in 2004, everyone was feeling hopeful that the city was coming back, that the cultural anchors really stayed with the city and the community and kept their doors open in spite of everything. And everything was soon to be quite difficult again.